Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Honestly, Let's Talk. I'm your host, Todd Nesloni, and I love doing these live Thursday episodes about a variety of topics with a variety of voices that I greatly respect and admire. And when I knew I wanted to have a conversation like the one we're going to have tonight, the first name that came to my head was Paul. So, Paul, thank you so much for being here. Kind of introduce yourself, tell people who you are.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. My name's Paul Emerich France. I am a national board certified teacher. I've been teaching for 11 years now, which is so wild to think that it's been over a decade. I'm actually currently a private teacher and a consultant. So I've published 2 books. One book is called Reclaiming Personalized Learning, and the other book is called Humanizing Distance Learning. And yeah, my passion is humanizing learning, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So thanks so much for me.
I'm so glad you mentioned those books too, because people, you need to go pick up his 2 books. They are fantastic, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff in them tonight. But the topic tonight is called Humanizing Learning. And I know some people are like, what does that even mean? Like, how is learning not humanized? How do we what does this even mean? So you start us off, Paul. What does this even mean, humanizing learning?
Yeah, well, the idea of humanization isn't new, and I don't want to like position myself as like the only person who's talking about humanization, right, or like the person who started a conversation about humanization, because I didn't. So think of the idea of humanizing as, and this is like a Paulo Freire Pedagogy via press term, right? That like the idea of humanization is to become more human and more whole as we learn, as we age and we grow. And I think we'd all agree that like that's sort of what learning is all about, right? We want our kids to connect with pieces of themselves, feel comfortable bringing pieces of themselves into the classroom so that they can become the best versions of themselves. And I think it's really important to talk about humanization, not only because we want our students to feel safe and valued and protected and loved, but also because so much of our culture was built on the dehumanization and marginalization of different types of people. So I know that people of color can identify this. I know that other LGBTQ people, such as myself, can identify with being marginalized and dehumanized even in broader society, but also in schools. I have my own stories, my own pain that comes from being an openly gay teacher. And so that has definitely informed, I guess, my perspective on what it means to really humanize our pedagogy so that all kids feel safe and included, and so they feel like they can truly grow into the best versions of themselves.
You know, you said there's so much in what you just said that I want to dive into. And your first book is all about reclaiming personalized learning, and I love the tagline about just restoring equity and humanity in our classrooms. And so you shared a little bit too about, your part of a group that has historically been marginalized and not equally served in the classroom and things like that. When did you realize how passionate this was going to be for you, that you knew not only did you have to speak up about it, but you needed to write about it, you needed to share with others and push that thinking? Because I think for some people, they get that mindset of, okay, I get this, I want to make change, but I'm too scared, I don't know where to start, I don't want to lose my job, I don't want to do this or that. Like, what was that journey like for you?
I identify with all of those feelings, first of all, about not wanting to lose your job and feeling scared and feeling vulnerable. Yeah, so I was working in public school, my first job, and it was as far as first jobs, like first teaching jobs go, it was like the creme de la creme. I was in a really great school, like really great professional learning culture where we were, encouraged to innovate and try things and take risks. And I felt really safe doing that for the most part. I had this amazing team that they were all at my wedding. Like I still am close with them. I love them dearly. And we just had this synergy,
I love that.
It was amazing. But it was 2013, and just at that point, marriage equality had just been legalized in Illinois. And one of my colleagues, a straight white guy, mind you, came to me and was like, hey, we should do a lesson on this, since this was just legalized. And I was like, absolutely, let's do it. And to make a very, very long story short, it did not go well. It did not go over well. We didn't actually get to teach the lesson. And it was one of the first times that I had to really come to terms with the fact that my identity was not welcome in my school. And those were really hard conversations to have. I actually had a conversation with the superintendent, and he said, Paul, this isn't personal. Like, I hope you don't feel like this is personal. This isn't personal. And I said, you're telling me that I can't talk about people like me in school. I don't know how I'm supposed to not take that personally, And so that was the point for me. I think that was one of the first points that I actually wrote about being a gay teacher and like what it felt like. And, I got a lot of validation, which was great, but I also got a lot of people pushing back on me and saying things like, that's inappropriate. You shouldn't be talking about your sexuality with kids. And I realized just how many biases, heteronormative biases people have. And they don't realize that, every day we are teaching kids about heterosexual, being heterosexual, right? Like when we share fairy tales in our classrooms, we're teaching about romance. That's sexuality, and people don't realize that because of the bias. And so I realized that a lot of work needed to be done, right? Like when we're talking about LGBTQ people, we're not talking about sex, we're talking about identity. And those are two very different things that I think we need to, that I think a lot of people need to understand better to embrace the LGBTQ community within their classrooms more.
Well, and when it comes to the words equity and humanity, it's such a varied topic, because I think, some people can think it's just skin color, or it's just religion, or it's just sexual orientation. It's like, it's that and so much more. And it's one of those things that can be overwhelming for people as they begin to enter that space. And so, what advice would you have for people who are like, I want to start bringing that human element into my classroom, but I don't even know where to begin? What would your advice be for them?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think a great place to start personally is just think about, it's like you have to do the internal work first, And I think if you really don't know where to start and you really feel uncomfortable, I think starting with asking yourself, like, what does it mean to you to be validated, to be seen, to be appreciated? Like, what does that feel like to you? And if you're a person that's fortunate enough to get that where you are, take a moment and just imagine, what would it be like if I wasn't afforded that privilege to feel seen and valued and heard in the space that I work in and the space that I learn in? Because I think when we put ourselves in the shoes of someone who has been marginalized and we see their feelings and their experiences as valid, we actually can for a moment feel even just like an ounce of that pain. I think everybody at one point or another has felt disconnected, has felt hurt, has felt, treated poorly. Like we all can identify with that feeling of pain. And so I think it starts with that internal work, but then it also starts with like believing people's lived experiences, and I say this as a gay man, but I also say this as a white man who is learning every day how to listen more intently to stories of people of color as well. I don't know the pain of racism, right? But I can like listen to it and I can believe it and I can amplify it and I can try to identify with the feeling of being marginalized, And so I think that's a good place to start. And then once you've gotten to that place where you're like, oh, I can identify those feelings, I can hear those stories and believe those stories. I think it's a matter of like starting to have those conversations about identity with your kids. And there's a lot of really great people that are doing really great work. I'm actually really, really excited for Liz Kleinrock's book.
Yes.
I believe it's called Start Here, Start Now. And I think, like in that message, I mean, I haven't read her book, so I don't know what it is, but when I hear the words start here, start now, it means like, give something a try. Like, don't be afraid to take risks and make mistakes. That's part of the work, I think, is taking risks and making mistakes. And we have to get comfortable with being imperfect when we're talking about identity.
So there's two things that I want to say as I'm listening to you talk. And the first one, I want to reiterate something you said that I thought was really powerful, and that is to believe the experiences of others. And I think that when you truly digest that statement, that's a heavy statement, because I think a lot of where some issues come from is some groups not believing what other groups are telling you they're going through.
Yep.
And you're not going through that. So you can't tell them they didn't feel that. That's not how it was. It's like, I went through it. Let me own my feelings, and you please believe what I felt. So I thought that was really powerful. But there's something else you said there too that I kind of want to address, and that is, and you mentioned it earlier, that as you get into this idea of trying to humanize your learning and bringing in some of these more difficult conversations and breaking down some walls, you're gonna make some mistakes. So I think that's important people to hear as well, is that you will make mistakes as you go through and do this, but it's not ever a process anyway where you were fully prepared. I mean, it's always a learning thing, and you're going to learn along the way. And I think you can attest to the fact that, you know, even though this is a passion of yours and you've been pushing this forward, you've still made mistakes too, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we actually were talking about this. We did a short series of Instagram lives, I guess they weren't lives, but we did this series. Nate Lyon and I did this series called Here and Queer, and it was all queer educators, and we were just kind of talking about issues that mattered to us. And Derek Carlson, who is at Black and Bright and Second on Instagram, he was talking about like how we have to, in classrooms where we're having these conversations about identity and where we're making mistakes and where we're trying our best, we're showing up, but we're making mistakes. We actually have to proactively build a culture where we normalize rupture and we normalize repair, right? And we have to prepare everybody for that to happen. And it's really hard work to do, right? It's like, it takes a lot of culture building, it takes a lot of norm building, but then it takes a lot of, like we said, right? Like believing people's experiences and really trying to, you know, meet them where they are and just take care of them. It's hard work. It's really hard work.
Well, you know, I want to dive into real quick your second book. Your newest one is Humanizing Distance Learning, which, hello, we all have experience with that right now. But again, I love the byline, which is the centering equity and humanity in times of crisis. And I love thinking about that, because to me, that's such an important element that I don't feel like we spend enough time as educators and with our colleagues and things diving into, is what do we do in times of crisis? Whether it's something like 9/11, whether it is a pandemic, whether it is the social unrest that's happening that our kids are seeing on the news, experiencing in their own lives, like all of this stuff. There are so many crises, I think that's the correct plural way, that are going on right now, that I feel like this message is so timely. So where did this come from, this next step in your evolution and in your writing?
Yeah, well, so it's a great question. So I was talking with my editor about, you know, like what was out there on distance learning. And he and I were talking, and we were like, the equity piece is not getting enough. It's not getting enough traction, right? We're talking a lot about like boots on the ground pedagogy, but you know, your conversations can't start and end with pedagogy, right? Like pedagogy is impactful, but you have to talk about the whole picture. And so I had said to him, I was like, I don't want to write a book just about distance learning. Like I can do that. I have a lot of experience with technology integration. I feel like I did distance learning very successfully last spring, but like, I don't want to write a book that's relevant to 6 months of our lives. You know, like that wasn't the intention behind the book. And originally, actually, the book was called Teaching from a Distance. That's what I originally wanted to call it. And the reason I wanted to call it that was because I had this question in my mind, like, is distance learning so hard for so many of us because we are replicating some of the same flawed practices in our classrooms that weren't working prior to the pandemic and certainly aren't going to work in distance, right? And all of these pedagogies that I refer to in the book are, they create dependent learning habits in kids. And that idea of dependent learning is, again, it's not something I coined. That's a Zaretta Hammond term from Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And so the book really is like, it uses distance learning sort of as a double entendre. That's like, we should be teaching from a distance, right? We should be teaching in a way that supports our students in their independence, whether we are teaching them face to face or whether we are teaching them through a screen. So that's like the idea behind the book. The idea of crisis too. I said to my editor again, I was like, I want this book to outlive this era, because we will come to another time of global crisis again. But then also we have to remember that like all of us have invisible crises that we experience when there isn't a global pandemic going on, right? Like we lose loved ones, like our lives get turned upside down for whatever reason. I know that's happened to me before, where I've had to go into my classroom and I've been like, I'm in a time of crisis right now. And it's hard to compartmentalize that while I'm trying to be a teacher. So, you know, part of the message of the book is like just about being a whole, making our classroom spaces where all of us, our students included, can be whole people all the time.
I love that so much. And, you know, as I'm thinking about this, and I know you've utilized a lot of these strategies in your classroom and with students and in all kinds of ways, is there a time or an example that you can think of that you're like, this was such a reminder that I'm doing the work that I'm meant to do, or that was a conversation I'm so glad we had because this happened, or it led to this, or, you know, I feel like sometimes educators, we have killer lessons and we're really proud of them or things like that. But to me, this is a whole nother level because you're dealing with a whole nother depth and emotion involved when you talk about humanizing learning. So as you reflect, is there an experience that sticks out to you?
Absolutely. So this story always comes to mind because I think in this story, right, this story is an example of centering a child's humanity, of redefining what success looks like in our classrooms, and then prioritizing connection and belonging for our students, even in academic learning. So there's a student I had some years ago who really struggled in math, really struggled in math, to the point where they were like under their desk crying when it came time to do a math task. And it was really tough, you know, because it's like, I mean, any teacher who's had that situation happening in their classrooms know exactly what that feels like, right? You're like, wow, someone is really in a moment of crisis right now, and I have to help that person, but I've got 20 other, 25 other, 30 other kids, you know, that I need to help too. So this child in particular, you know, they would cry every single time we do math. I knew that the first part of my work with them was that I had to understand where those feelings were coming from, believe their experience, right? Not write it off, not get them just to comply with me. Like I had to partner with them to help them overcome this emotional hurdle before they were going to feel like they were a part of the mathematical culture of the classroom. So we talked about, I do a lot of proactive social emotional work in my classrooms anyway, but this student and I talked a lot about like, what are the feelings that come up? How can we process those? Like, what can we do to cope with those so that you can jump back in and, you know, be a part of the class? And we came up with a really simple, go to the couch, get a squishy, take some deep breaths for about 2 minutes, and then come back and try again. And so that was the first step. But then it was also like helping that student see that they had strengths and things to offer. And I remember this one day in particular, we were trying to multiply by eights. And when you struggle with, you know, numeracy, counting, like multiplying by eights is really hard. It's just really hard. And so I said to them, they were trying to, you know, solve the task. I said, well, what do you know? What do you know that might help you multiply by eights? And they were like, well, I can count by twos. I said, great, let's count by twos. And so they wrote down 2, 4, 6, 8, and they circled that. And then they wrote down 10, 12, 14, 16, and then circle that, and so on and so forth until they got up to, I think it was 56. And I was like, wow, this is an amazing strategy. Look, you just used what you knew to get you up to 56. You figured out 8 times 7. Will you share this method with the class in our math discussion? And luckily for me, they agreed to do that. They shared the method. You know, they got a shout out from the class. They got validation for their method. But the coolest part about it was a week later, another student chose to use that method during our math journaling time. And so I walked over to them and I was like, hey, I want you to come and look at what someone else is doing. And I walked them over and I said, look, they're using your method from last week. And their face just lit up.
I love that.
Well, I didn't ask them why their face lit up, but I know why it did. It's because they finally saw that they actually added value to this class, And to me, that's what humanizing learning is about. It's about helping everybody feel like they have something to offer and contribute, like they can be seen for their strengths. It doesn't mean we ignore the challenges, right? It doesn't mean we don't address those, but like we center their humanity, and we do that by like validating them and helping them feel as though they belong. And so that's like a story that comes to mind for me of like, that is what humanizing learning is all about. And that's what we need to do more of as we enter this hopefully new phase of education where that matters. Where that matters more than anything else.
That is such a beautiful story, and it's like if you don't understand the power after hearing that, I don't know how many more stories we have to tell you, but that's such a clear example of just a simple thing that you can do that brings them in. I love it. Well, Paul, as we close out today, if people are listening and they're like, okay, Paul, I just need one takeaway. Give me what's the biggest thing I need to understand about humanizing learning? What's your one thing?
My one thing is that belonging matters more than anything else. And so that should be what we all focus on in our classrooms, whatever that looks like for you in your setting with your students. If you notice your students are struggling, if you notice that they're failing to connect with the collective classroom, I think start with belonging. And I think it will guide you in humanizing your pedagogy.
I love that. Well, for those of you that are watching live or are catching the recording, thank you so much. And for those of you checking on the podcast, go check out Paul's 2 books, Reclaiming Personalized Learning and Humanizing Distance Learning. They're both linked in the comments here, but go check them out. They're fantastic. I hope you have enjoyed today's conversation as much as I have. I love learning from Paul on social media. He always pushes my thinking and is one of those necessary people in my circle. And so, Paul, thank you for spending some time with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, everybody. Remember, you can check out all the past episodes on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, wherever you get your stuff. It's there. And you can join live every Thursday, except next Thursday. We actually have a special episode happening on Tuesday night with one of my dear friends talking about celebrating Ramadan. So definitely come in and check that one out.